Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Tuesday, August 9, 2022. It's about 10 minutes after 2 o'clock in the afternoon here on the East Coast of the United States. My guest today, of course, is no stranger to those of you who regularly watch us, Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Colonel Macgregor, we're so happy that you're here. I read recently in USA Today that Vladimir Putin sacked the general who is his commander-in-chief in Ukraine, General Dvornikov. Is this true? And if so, why would something like this happen?
Well, first of all, I assume it's true, but I have no personal evidence to corroborate it, Judge. One thing to keep in mind is that Russia is very different from the United States. In Russia, the political leader makes policy and the generals execute it rather than the other way around. And as a result, I think the commander in Ukraine had gone as far as he could, and it was decided that they needed a new set of eyes to take over and complete the mission. That's what I would assume.
In Time magazine, and I'm quoting sources that I don't usually rely on, and quite frankly, don't even read, but the numbers were startling. Reports that the Russian army has suffered losses of 80,000 deaths. I mean, could that possibly be true? A number of that magnitude?
The short answer is no. That's utterly nonsensical. I think that more accurate numbers are probably 13 to 15,000 dead on the Russian side, and perhaps 60 to 80,000 dead on the Ukrainian side. So you have to look at these sources and understand what you're hearing. We don't have absolutely airtight certainty about the figures I just cited, but I think they're closer to reality.
Am I hearing what the Central Intelligence Agency wants me to hear?
Yeah, I suspect that's the case, Judge, yes.
What is the state of affairs, military affairs, as we speak in Ukraine?
Well, right now, and as I pointed out a few weeks ago to you, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, the majority of the regular Russian army had been withdrawn from contact with the Ukrainian enemy. And they were being rested, refitted, reorganized, and prepared to renew the offensive in August. I think we're beginning to see that happen now, particularly down in the south, where I think we're going to watch as Odessa falls and Ukraine becomes a landlocked country as a result. The Ukrainians have been unable to put together any sort of counteroffensive. So I don't see much evidence that the Ukrainians can stop this. At the same time, we should also point out that there have been some operations outside of Kharkov, just south of it, and these look suspiciously like shaping operations.
What does that mean, Colonel?
Well, limited offensive operations to prepare the way for a larger offensive later. In other words, to test Ukrainian defenses and then to open avenues of approach. So I think first comes the operation in the south, and then subsequently up in Kharkov. And again, as we've discussed before, I don't see any evidence that the Ukrainians can stop any of it. So I think this will proceed. And I'd be surprised if this is not completed by the end of August, beginning of September. You remember that the Russians do not want to have to deal with the mud in the spring when the rains come. That slows everything down.
Are the areas of Ukraine now under Russian military control? I'm going to use a word, I don't even know if it's a legitimate word, being Russified by the Russian government. Are the banks starting to require rubles? Is the language changing? Are government officials changing loyalty, or have new officials been installed? Are Ukrainian snipers trying to make life miserable for people that cooperate with the Russians? Are Ukrainians killing Ukrainians? What is life like there today?
The majority of the people in these areas were never Ukrainian. They were always Russian. And the language spoken there was Russian. The Ukrainians tried to Ukrainianize the populations there. And that produced the backlash. That also reduced Russians to second-class citizenship and ultimately led to the conflict that we're involved with right now. Because the Russians simply wanted equal rights for Russians inside Ukraine, and that was rejected. That was part of the Minsk Accords. We don't need to go back over that. But the bottom line is, to answer your question, I think the areas are already Russian. And what's happening now is that, yes, the ruble is the currency. New governments are being set up composed of the local Russian citizenry. And for all intents and purposes, I would expect these areas to become permanently Russian. They'll either be part of a new Russian Republic of Ukraine or they're part of Russia.
How does the Biden administration get out of this? I mean, there must be some end game being planned. I don't know how he could possibly sell an end game on the American public after he's given away $60 billion in cash and surplus military equipment, some of it new and I guess all of it unused. Do they have an end game in mind, or do they still labor under the illusion that American assistance without fighting troops on the ground can result in an expulsion of the Russians and a victory by Ukraine?
First of all, whenever you begin a military operation, there are three critical questions that have to be asked. What's the purpose? How do you plan to accomplish this particular mission or task? And then finally, what do you want it to look like when it's over? We have ignored those questions consistently, I would argue, since 1965 in almost every operation we were part of. Desert Storm might be an exception, depending upon how you want to interpret that outcome. But the bottom line is that we didn't go into this with purpose, method, end state in mind. Well, we have been building up the Ukrainian armed forces in earnest since 2012, I would argue really after 2014, building the Ukrainians into the largest army associated with NATO, well-equipped, well-trained, all for the purpose of challenging Russian control of Crimea and ultimately presenting a threat to Russia, which we, and I say we loosely, I'm talking about the administration since 2014, have treated as being in our interest, that this was somehow good to make Russia vulnerable to threats and make them miserable. And the only thing I've ever heard ever since this got off the ground was our purpose is to harm Russia, to weaken it. And then they added later on, well, weaken it so that it can never do what it's doing again in Ukraine. So to answer your question, I don't think any of those things have been addressed. And I think that Washington is surprised. I don't know why, but they're surprised that things have turned out the way they are.
Does Washington want to put fighting troops on the ground, or stated differently, does Washington want to put uniforms on the troops already on the ground and put weapons in their hands?
Well, first of all, you're talking about American troops.
Yes.
No, absolutely not. I think privately, the Army Chief of Staff and certainly Milley have both admitted that the U.S. Army is in no condition to fight a war. They can't recruit. They're suffering from an acute
no condition to
shortage.
fight a war. Isn't it their constitutional mission to be ready to fight a war?
Well, you could make the same comment about all the armed forces, but the truth is that the armed forces largely, especially Army, Marines, but I think the Army is probably one of the worst examples. Navy's probably almost as bad. Really exist to provide jobs for generals. So you have this enormous bureaucracy that is built up over time. Today, we have in the United States Armed Forces 40 four-star generals and admirals. 40. Now, to those who don't understand what this means, during World War II, when we had 12.2 million men under arms fighting all over the world, at the height of that war, until the war was nearly over, we only had 7 four-stars. Today, we have 1.1 million under arms, and we have 40. Now, anyone who knows anything about military history knows that this kind of overhead is corrupting. It's unnecessary. It constipates and slows down decision-making. It makes for bad policy. So I think in this sense, we're Banana Republic-like, in that we have lots of people running around as generals, wearing lots and lots of medals, none of which have anything to do with fighting on anybody under fire or killing anybody or being valorous, but a lot to do with, I was in the theater when this happened, and I was here when this happened, and my fellow generals rewarded me with more decorations. It's embarrassing. This is a terrible mess that needs to be addressed. So I think that you're right. That is the constitutional obligation, but no, we're not ready to do anything. Our combat units are a fraction of the size of the force that we call the U.S. Army. When you go into the Marines, you have 63,000, 65,000 Marines in aviation and aviation support alone. When you go down and look at the numbers of Marine infantry regiments and you count the numbers of Marines that you've got in those, that's only 30, perhaps 30,000. So where is everyone? Well, you have a multitude of headquarters all over the world, all these regional unified commands, these functional commands. Then you have single service commands. We have a lot of 4-stars in the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. All of this is nonsense. It's not needed. It should have gone away in the 90s with the end of the Cold War. Instead, it got bigger.
I am sure that President Xi of China and his advisors are fully aware of what you have just described.
Well, I'm afraid they are. I know that Putin is. And if you look at the command structures in China and the command structure in Russia, they're much leaner, far fewer senior officers, very, very functionally organized. The minimal numbers of people in those headquarters that are required. We do the opposite. You know, there was a joke in 91 when we went to war there. People said to me, well, you know, Doug, we know we can win this. All we need to do is challenge the Iraqi enemy to a PowerPoint briefing contest. Our PowerPoint briefs are better. So we already knew it was bad then. But in retrospect, that looks almost ideal compared with what you've got now.
Some of the senators, some of the Democratic senators late last week, wrote a letter to President Biden asking him to declare Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. What the heck would that accomplish? And after the U.S. just offed Zawahiri, is the U.S. a state sponsor of terrorism?
Look, you know, Judge, they know from experience that once you label a particular state as a state sponsor of terrorism, it makes it impossible to do business with the state. So if you're trying to enshrine Russia as a permanent enemy, or China or anyone else, the quickest way to do it is say, oh, well, you're sponsoring terrorism. That has more to do with the desire to keep the conflict going in perpetuity and to sabotage any attempts at understanding, cooperation, or diplomacy. I mean, even when you go to war, one of the most important things you try to do is keep means of communication open to your opponent, because inevitably you want the war to end.
Right.
Only we don't do that because these conflicts that we've created are cash cows, enormous cash cows for the military-industrial congressional complex, which was the original term that Eisenhower used in his speech. And they took congressional out because they said, well, General, you're making enough enemies. Let's not put Congress in there. But the truth is, it is the military-industrial congressional complex, and
because the military-industrial complex could not exist without the largesse from Congress.
Absolutely. So this is, and again, you go back to the 44 stars. This is another bonanza for industry. It gives them more people to approach with more solutions to create more redundancy unnecessarily and spend more money.
Let me take you to another part of the world, Colonel, about which you also have substantial expertise. How reckless was Mrs. Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, following on the heels by about a month or two of the president's unscripted "we will forcefully defend Taiwan" comment?
Well, there's a vast difference between sending Mrs. Pelosi to Kiev, or Kyiv if you want, and making stupid statements, and sending her to Taiwan. And this is the difference. The Russians laugh. They know us. Putin has always had a healthy respect for us when we knew what we were doing. He knows we don't know what we're doing. He knows that we're fragmented, we're divided, we're corrupt. So the Russians just laughed off Mrs. Pelosi and everybody else that visited Kiev as irrelevant and stupid. The Chinese are not doing that. And that's because the Chinese really don't understand us, have no understanding whatsoever of this admittedly clown show that goes on a daily basis in Washington, D.C. And she is viewed as a member of the United States government, a key member, whereas the Russians would simply see her as another politician and on the Hill trying to make a reputation and dismiss it. The Chinese take it very seriously. Secondly, we've had agreements in place with the Chinese, starting with the Shanghai Communique, and finally, Jimmy Carter's decision to formally end any alliance and any support for Taiwan in the event that it was attacked. That was in 1979. So if you look at the 70s and all these agreements that we've reached, and suddenly the Chinese are surprised that we are abandoning these agreements. They don't understand that. The Chinese take these things very seriously. They take the presence of a U.S. official in Taiwan who seems to be reinforcing an utterly irresponsible remark by the President of the United States to send a signal that we are prepared to go to war with China. The Chinese are not interested in going to war with us. In fact, the Chinese aren't interested in going to war with anybody. It's bad for business. The Chinese are about business and making lots of money, not war.
Don't the Chinese know that we are incapable of defending Taiwan in a meaningful and serious way? If they should use military force to neuter it or to bring it in their ambit?
The Chinese know that we have the most powerful and effective submarine fleet in the world. That submarine fleet is quite capable of shutting down the Chinese coastline. They could sit offshore 150 nautical miles out and effectively sink anything coming out of or going into China. That's one of the reasons the Chinese have invested so heavily in this One Belt, One Road project, trying to develop the capacity to sustain themselves, their economy, and their population across the Eurasian continent. Fortunately for them, Russia, which historically had been hostile to China, is now a friend, now an ally, and is providing them all the energy that they can use. So they have a healthy respect for what we can do with the submarine force. As for the rest of it, the Chinese had originally planned for reunification, according to Xi, in 2049, Judge. That was the target date that Xi had announced. Now, come on. That's because the Chinese...
Does he plan to stay in the presidency that long?
No, but remember, he's effectively the emperor. He will be succeeded by another dynasty, a new emperor. But the point is that there was an expectation that in the intervening period, those two countries would grow close regardless. And in fact, to a large extent, that has happened. And people don't understand that you have I would say 48% who voted for the KMT party, Chiang Kai-shek's old party in the last election and lost. They would willingly, voluntarily join China. There's no question about it. And people don't understand that China is not seriously a communist country. If anything, it's a one-party fascist state that rests on a foundation of state capitalism.
Then what should we make of the president's statement? He didn't know what he was talking about. He's trying to please some audience. He's trying to frighten another audience. Why would he say, and I know you're not a shrink, you're a military guy, we will defend Taiwan forcefully?
Incomprehensible to me. I can't explain it, because any reasonable person would simply look at the map and say, this is 7,000 miles away from the United States. Moving forces that far that will make any difference to the outcome is extremely difficult, very hazardous today. The Chinese now have lots of submarines, but more important, they have enormous intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities overhead in space. They can track everything we do. They can turn most of our surface fleet into a target in short order. So the bottom line is, why would we travel halfway around the world to make war on China on China's doorstep? It's a strategically stupid idea. Now, if the Chinese want to make war on us and they'd like to sail over off the coast of California, that would be very advantageous to us. They'd be very stupid. Right. So the point is, the whole idea of war with China is just a dumb idea. It ought to be shelved, and there's no reason for it. We can work out our differences without that. But this notion of now presenting suddenly overnight Taiwan as this glistening city on the hill of democracy and liberalism, it's just misleading. All the states in Northeast Asia are quite similar. Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, very similar values and attitudes. And we don't understand those things. They're different from us. This whole thing is unnecessary. So why did he say what he did? Someone planted the idea in him, or he wouldn't have said it. So you'll have to ask who's running the show in the White House.
Let me take you back just to about a year or two ago. Did President Trump order the Pentagon to return a substantial number of troops then in Afghanistan? And did the Pentagon, by hook or by crook, decline to comply with that order?
What happened was as follows. The president, as you know, had first made an attempt in 2017 to extricate our forces from Afghanistan. Convened a meeting in the White House in the summer in July. All of the great men of defense were there. Mattis, his national security advisor at the time, McMaster, other senior military people, advisors, cabinet. And the president said, I think we've been there long enough. We are not accomplishing anything. I think we should get out. And the entire group stood up and obstructed his wishes and said, oh, no, you can't leave. If you leave, the world as we know it will end. We will have sacrificed and we will have gained nothing. And he said, we've already got nothing. What are we getting for it? How do we benefit from doing this? Why are we there? Why aren't the regional actors involved? Of course, nobody wanted to hear that. So he gave up. He tried again a couple of times. And then finally, I was called to the White House. Let's see, this would have been the 9th of November, and told that they had removed the Secretary of Defense. They were appointing a new temporary secretary. And
this is right after the Biden-Trump election.
Yes. Well, this is 9 November. And This is after he fired Esper. Esper, of course, was always in lockstep with Milley, who was really always running the show anyway.
Milley is General Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Right. And essentially, Esper did whatever he told him to do. And Esper was very sensitive to what we call it the deep state. I just call it the federal bureaucracy and the MICC, what they wanted. And they wanted no end to the conflict. And, you had Mitch McConnell and everyone else on the Hill on the right, and most of the people on the left were all 100% on board with keeping this conflict going and maintaining a presence there in perpetuity. And I was called in, and I was asked to wait. And then a meeting was held with the new acting secretary. And then John McEntee, who was a special assistant, came back with a list of tasks for me to perform as the new senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense. And I said, well, I'll do what I can, but I have no statutory authority. There's only one man who can withdraw forces from Afghanistan, which was number one on the list, and that's the Secretary of Defense. So I went back and I told the Secretary of Defense the next day that, what I'd gotten. I said, have you gotten a list of tasks? He said, no. I said, well, I did. He said, can I see it? I said, sure. And I said, looking at this list, I said, perhaps one or two on that list, specifically Afghanistan, we can make that happen. We could conceivably also remove forces from Syria and Iraq. That's relatively easy. You can drive out quickly. But I said, beyond that, I don't think we can do that. And he agreed. And I said, by the way, Mr. Secretary, I don't think you can do this without a direct order from the president that's written. You're an acting secretary. And he said, no, I think you're right. I said, well, I'll get you an order. And so I left, and I called over to the White House, and we had discussed this the night before on the 9th. And I said, look, you've got to have an order. And said, well, what does the order have to say? I drafted it right then and there over the phone, gave them instructions. And I said, okay, let me know if you need anything else. A few hours later, this is about 5 p.m, I get a frantic call from one of the staffers on the NSC staff. Said, okay, we've got your order. We understand that, but what are the authorities? What are the legal authorities and everything else? I said, go and get a presidential decision memorandum out of the file cabinet, any number of them, and they will give you the legal authorities, his authorities under the Constitution, so forth.
Check Article 2 of the Constitution. The president shall be commander in chief.
Yeah, and in addition to that, it'll help you with distribution, show you who needs to receive the order. So I said, okay, got it. Thanks so much. I never heard anything again until Thursday afternoon. This was Tuesday. And the Thursday afternoon, I'm told that the president had signed the order. And I had hoped that we would get a draft. I had asked them to send a draft back before they went final, but it all took off on its own. Changed some of the dates, but essentially it said everything is going to be out by 15 January. And keep in mind that pulling out of Afghanistan in the winter was always a very good idea, because in the winter, most of the people who might otherwise interfere with you are up in the mountains standing next to stoves in their caves. They're not wandering around in the open. So it's the low ebb in the so-called fighting season. There's no fighting at that time of year. So that's when you wanted to get out. Well, unfortunately, what happened was that he wrote this 15 January deadline. He signed it. As soon as it was signed, somebody bootlegged it over to the Senate. And I guess Mitch McConnell went berserk. We can't just leave. This is impossible. Subsequently, Milley gets a hold of this, said, absolutely not. This cannot happen. We are not leaving Afghanistan. And there was a big powwow in the White House, and all the principals were there, and the president backed down. And he said, all right, well, I'll take half out. And they all looked at each other, okay, we'll live with half, but you can't leave Afghanistan. So he lost the battle at that point. And of course, at that point, I no longer had any credibility.
Yeah, had he stood firm, the order that you drafted and he signed was a perfectly lawful, utterly constitutional document.
Yes,
to which General Milley and his subordinates ought to have complied. Am I right? This is military law and constitutional law 101.
Yeah, but that's not the way business is done in Washington, and the generals have not been doing business that way for a long time, Judge.
General, you never, I'm sorry, I called you General. Colonel, you never fail to educate us on contemporary military affairs and now recent history. We are deeply grateful for all the time you spend with us. Until the next time, thanks so much for joining us.
Sure. Thank you, Judge.
Judge Napolitano for Judging Freedom.